She dressed like the perfect caregiver, always pushing that quiet boy in a wheelchair through the park at the same time every morning. People thought she was a loving mother until the day she wheeled him to the edge of a bridge, looked down into the water, and did something no one could believe. But what happened next? No one could have imagined, not even her. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share more incredible, true stories. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Now let's jump into the story. Larchmere Park was the kind of place that made you feel like time had slowed down. Each morning, the walking paths were dotted with joggers, dog walkers, and families with strollers. Trees lined the trails, and the small lake at the park's center reflected the sky like a mirror. It was the heart of the town, calm, quiet, safe. Every day at 8 a.m. sharp, Helen Whitaker arrived at the park pushing a wheelchair. She was always dressed perfectly. Her long beige coat, polished boots, and tidy hair made her look like someone from a magazine. The boy in the chair, Milo, sat motionless. He was about 14, with pale skin and soft brown hair that never moved in the wind. His head tilted slightly to one side and his eyes followed the trees and birds, but his body didn't move. People who saw them thought it was sweet, a wealthy woman taking care of a disabled child, giving him sunshine and fresh air every morning. Helen never stopped to chat, but she smiled politely if someone greeted her. To most onlookers, she was the picture of quiet kindness. But not everyone saw it that way. Eddie Maher, the park's custodian, had worked there for over 15 years. He was a retired firefighter in his 60s, with gray in his beard and calloused hands. He preferred plants and animals to people, and he liked things that made sense. And something about Helen didn't make sense. His dog, Leo, noticed it first. Leo was a golden retriever who had worked with search and rescue teams before Eddie adopted him. Now in retirement, Leo spent his mornings following Eddie around the park, while he trimmed bushes or fixed benches. But every time Helen and Milo passed by, Leo stiffened. His ears went up, his tail stopped wagging, and sometimes, just sometimes, he gave a low, uneasy growl. "Easy, buddy," Eddie would whisper, placing a hand on the dog's back. "She's just passing through." But Leo didn't seem to agree. Over time, Eddie began to pay closer attention. Helen's walks with Milo were always the same. 3 loops around the lake, never stopping, always avoiding conversation. But as the leaves started to turn and October crept in, Helen's routine began to shift. She walked faster. Her eyes darted more often. And when she passed the old wooden bridge over the lake's narrowest point, she sometimes slowed down just for a moment, looking down into the water like it held secrets. One Thursday, Eddie noticed something else. Helen was wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. Her usual calm smile was missing. She looked tense. Later that day, Maria, a young college student who volunteered at the park on weekends, found a piece of paper crumpled near a bench by the water. The writing was smudged, but the words were still readable. "He deserves more, but I can't give it. This world is too quiet for him now." Maria, assuming it was a page from someone's forgotten diary, tossed it into the trash bag she was using. She didn't mention it to anyone. Meanwhile, Eddie started having trouble sleeping. Something about the woman in the park, the motionless boy, and Leo's strange behavior didn't sit right with him. He didn't believe in gut feelings, he liked facts. But Leo had never acted like this before, and Eddie had seen enough strange things during his years as a firefighter to trust when something felt off. On the 3rd week of October, Eddie noticed Helen take a different route. Instead of her usual loops, she wheeled Milo down a less traveled path toward the far end of the lake, toward the bridge that stretched over the deepest part of the water. Leo's reaction was immediate. He pulled hard on his leash, barking sharply. It startled Eddie. The dog had never behaved like that, not even during thunder. "Leo," Eddie called, grabbing the leash with both hands. But Leo wasn't trying to attack. His eyes were locked on Helen and Milo, his body tense, his bark urgent. Helen turned to face them. Her face had changed. It wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, cold, almost panicked. "Control your dog," she snapped. "You're frightening the boy." Milo, however, showed no signs of fear. His expression didn't change at all. He stared straight ahead, his eyes quiet and still. "I'm sorry," Eddie said quickly, pulling Leo back. He's usually better than this." Helen said nothing. She turned the wheelchair around and pushed it away down the path. That night, Eddie sat on his porch with Leo at his feet. He looked out at the quiet street, but his thoughts were miles away. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" he asked the dog softly. Leo lifted his head and stared back, tail still. Something about that woman wasn't right. Something about that boy didn't add up. And whatever it was, Eddie had a feeling it was going to surface very soon. The next morning started colder than usual. A layer of fog hung over Larchmere Park, and the grass sparkled with frost. The air was quiet, except for the distant sound of birds and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. Eddie arrived at the park early, bundled in his thick flannel jacket. Leo walked beside him, nose low to the ground. Something about the silence felt strange, like the park was holding its breath. From across the field, Eddie spotted Helen. She was pushing Milo toward the old bridge again. Today, she wasn't dressed in her usual expensive coat. Instead, she wore a simple gray sweater and jeans. Her hair, normally perfect, looked rushed and messy. She wasn't following their usual path either. She was headed straight for the bridge at the far end, the one where the lake grew darker, deeper. Eddie's stomach tightened. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a sudden urge to follow. "Stay here," he told his assistant, who had just arrived. "Watch the cart, I'll be back." Leo, already alert, was pulling at the leash. Eddie paused for a second, then made a choice he wouldn't normally make. He unclipped the leash. "Go," he said. "Find them." Leo took off like a shot, paws pounding across the frosty grass, nose in the wind. Eddie followed, walking quickly, then jogging, his boots crunching through fallen leaves. His heart pounded, not just from the run, but from something else. Dread. Ahead he saw them. Helen standing still in the middle of the bridge, Milo's wheelchair parked beside her. She was looking down at the water, her arms stiff at her sides. From the distance, Eddie couldn't hear what she was saying, but she seemed to be talking. Not to herself, but to Milo. And then, without warning, she moved. She stepped behind the wheelchair and gave it a sudden hard shove. The wheels hit the wooden railing with a loud crack. Then the entire chair tipped forward, snapping through the wood and disappearing into the freezing water below with a splash. Eddie shouted, "No!" but his voice was lost in the cold wind. Helen froze for a second, staring at the water. Her face was pale, eyes wide. Then, to Eddie's shock, she jumped. She kicked off her shoes and leapt into the lake after Milo, arms reaching as she disappeared. Beneath the surface, Leo had already reached the edge of the bridge. Without hesitation, the golden retriever leaped over the broken railing and plunged into the water. By the time Eddie reached the bridge, everything was chaos. The wheelchair floated upside down, spinning slowly. Helen was thrashing in the water, gasping and shouting. And then there was Milo. Milo was swimming. His arms were weak and slow, but they were moving. His head bobbed just above the surface as he struggled toward the edge, not in panic, but with purpose. Leo swam beside him, nudging him gently from one side, keeping him steady. It was almost like the dog knew exactly what to do. Helen, nearby, was splashing toward them, yelling, "Help him! Please help!" Eddie didn't hesitate. He climbed down the bank, water soaking into his boots as he stepped into the freezing lake. The cold hit him like a slap to the chest, but he pushed forward. He reached Milo first. The boy's eyes were wide, full of something Eddie had never seen before. Fear, yes, but also something else. Awareness. Will. "I've got you," Eddie said, wrapping his arm around Milo's back. "You're okay. I've got you." Leo swam close, licking Milo's face, then circled back toward Helen. With effort, Eddie pulled Milo toward the shore. His legs ached, his hands numb from the cold, but he kept going. Other people had arrived now, 2 joggers who had seen the splash from the trail. Together they helped Eddie lift Milo onto the shore. Milo coughed and shivered, water dripping from his hair. But to everyone's surprise, his fingers twitched. His lips moved, like he was trying to form a word. Helen collapsed beside him, sobbing. "It was supposed to help," she gasped. "It was in his mother's notes. It was supposed to help him." An ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics wrapped Milo in blankets and started warming his body. Eddie stepped back, dripping wet, watching as Leo sat quietly beside Milo, tail wagging gently. The doctors would later say it was a miracle that Milo had survived. But that wasn't the real shock. The real shock came when a nurse noticed Milo's hand closing around Helen's wrist, deliberate and strong. Later that day at the hospital, a doctor approached Eddie. "Mr. Maher," she said, "you may want to hear this. Milo, he's awake, and he's asking to see you." Eddie looked at Leo, who wagged his tail as if to say, "Told you so." Something had changed that morning, and it was only the beginning. The hospital was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. Inside room 214, Milo lay still in bed, wrapped in warm blankets. His face was pale, but his eyes were wide open and alert. He was watching everything. Eddie Maher sat beside him, still damp from the morning's events. Leo was curled up at the foot of the hospital bed, his head resting near Milo's feet. The dog hadn't left the boy's side since they arrived. Nurse named Callie entered with a smile. She carried a large plastic board covered in letters and symbols. "We're going to try something," she said softly. "We think Milo might be able to spell words." Eddie raised his eyebrows. "He can move?" "Not much," Callie replied, "but enough. He's been using small finger movements and he's blinking on purpose. I think he's trying to talk." She placed the board in front of Milo, adjusted his pillow, and held a small pointer in his hand. "Milo," she said, "if you understand me, blink twice." Milo blinked. Once, then again. Eddie leaned forward. His heart started to pound. Callie smiled. "All right, let's try spelling." With effort, Milo's finger began to move. Slowly, shakily, he pointed to the first letter. S, then H-E-T-R. I-E-D-T-O-H-E-L-P, Callie read aloud. She tried to help. Eddie stared, hardly believing what he was seeing. More letters followed. I-A-S-K-E-D-H-E-R. He asked her. Eddie repeated, stunned. "Milo, are you saying you asked Helen to try the water therapy?" Milo blinked twice. "Yes." Callie paused and looked at Eddie. "That changes everything." Over the next few hours, with many breaks to rest, Milo spelled out more. He explained that Helen wasn't his mother. She was a hired caregiver who had stepped in after his real mother passed away. Eddie shook his head slowly. "All this time, people thought she was your mom." Milo blinked again. "Yes." He explained that his real mother had believed he could recover. She'd kept journals, notes about therapies that showed small signs of success. She had tried everything, including warm and cold water treatments. After she passed, Helen found the journals and continued the therapy in secret. "Why not tell the doctors?" Eddie asked. Milo spelled T-H-E-Y-D-I-D-N-O-T-B-E-L-I-E-V-E. Callie nodded. "Sadly, that happens. Locked-in syndrome is rare. Most people don't expect improvement." Eddie stood up and paced slowly around the room. Everything that had confused him was starting to make sense. Helen's nervous behavior, the way she avoided talking to people, the bridge, the fear. She thought she had no other choice, Eddie murmured. He looked at Milo. "But why do it that way? Why push you off the bridge?" Milo's response was slow. His eyes blinked, then his finger moved again. I-S-A-I-D-Y-E-S. Eddie stared at the board. "You agreed to it?" Blink. The room fell quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the soft thud of Leo's tail against the bed. She was desperate, Eddie whispered. Later, a doctor came into the room. Her name was Dr. Jensen. She had kind eyes and short hair that curled at the ends. I just reviewed Milo's scans, she said. We're seeing brain activity we didn't expect. Areas that were quiet before are now lit up. What does that mean? Eddie asked. Dr. Jensen looked hopeful but cautious. It means something was reactivated, likely from the cold shock and adrenaline. It's risky and not a treatment we recommend, but something changed. She turned to Milo. You've done something most people in your condition never do. You moved, and you communicated. That's incredible. Milo blinked slowly. Dr. Jensen added, We'll begin a full rehabilitation plan. It's going to be long and hard, but you've already taken the first step. That evening, after the medical team left, Eddie stayed behind with Leo. Milo rested, his breathing calm. He looked at Eddie, then toward Leo. With effort, he moved his hand slightly, just enough to reach the dog's fur. He stayed by you the whole time, Eddie said, watching the gentle moment. He knew something was wrong long before we did. Milo spelled one last message before dozing off. H-E-K-N-E-W-F-E-A-R. Eddie gave a quiet nod. He really did. He looked out the hospital window into the night sky. For the first time, in years, something inside him stirred. Hope. 1 year later, the bridge at Larchmere Park looked just the same. The wooden boards had been repaired, the railing replaced, but the lake below still shimmered with the same quiet, steady movement. It was a cool autumn morning, almost exactly like the one when everything had changed. Milo sat near the bridge, now, not in his old wheelchair, but in a new one designed to support his back while giving him more independence. A soft blanket covered his legs and a wool cap sat snug on his head. He looked older now, not just in age, but in spirit. Stronger. Braver. Beside him stood Eddie Marr, one hand resting on the handles of the chair, the other holding a thermos of hot tea. And at Milo's feet, as always, lay Leo, now with a slight limp but still as watchful and loyal as ever. A small group had gathered at the park that morning. Helen stood quietly off to one side, her eyes red but full of something softer than regret. Forgiveness, maybe. She wore a simple coat and carried a small candle in her hand. Dr. Jensen was there too, along with Nurse Callie, and even a few local townspeople who had heard about Milo's recovery. A year ago, no one had looked twice at the boy in the wheelchair. Now people came just to hear him speak, and today, he would. With the help of a portable speech device and a microphone clipped to his jacket, Milo took a deep breath. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed the buttons, but his voice, though robotic, was loud and clear. Last year, the voice began, I almost disappeared. Everyone grew quiet. Even the wind seemed to hush. I was awake but trapped. My body wouldn't listen. My words were locked inside. People looked at me, but didn't see me. He paused, letting the message settle. But someone did. A dog, and a man who listened to the dog, and a woman who believed I could still fight. Helen looked down at her hands, the candle flickering in the breeze. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. They saved me, not just from the water, but from being forgotten. Milo's eyes swept over the small crowd. I'm not finished yet. I still need help to speak, to move, to live, but I am here. And I am learning. Every day. Eddie felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked out at the lake, remembering the splash, the cold, the fear. Then he looked at Milo, and all he saw now was light. The crowd applauded softly. Milo offered a small, lopsided smile, the kind he had worked months in therapy to master. After the speech, people came up to shake his hand, to thank him, and to thank Eddie. A few took pictures. Leo even got a few hugs from children who had heard he was a hero. Once the group had thinned, Helen approached slowly. Milo looked up at her. Their eyes met, holding a quiet understanding that didn't need words. I brought something, she said gently, holding out a small object. It was a water-worn stone, smooth and flat with the words "Don't give up" carved into the surface. It was your mother's, she said. She kept it on her desk. Milo reached out and took it with a shaky hand. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. Helen smiled through her tears. I'm glad you're finding your way. That afternoon, back at Eddie's home, Milo sat at the kitchen table while Eddie prepared soup. The house had changed over the past year. Ramps installed, wider, doors, grab bars in the bathroom. But the biggest change was in the feeling. It no longer felt like a quiet place for one. It felt full. Lived in. Alive. You know, Eddie said as he ladled soup into 2 bowls. When I retired, I thought I was done being useful. I was happy just trimming bushes and fixing benches. But you... He placed a bowl in front of Milo. You brought life back into this house. Milo smiled, then lifted a spoon on his own. His hand still shook, but he didn't spill. You're not just recovering, Eddie continued, you're leading. Milo picked up his tablet and typed out a simple response. So are you. That evening, as the sun began to set, they walked, rolled and walked, down the sidewalk behind the house. The trees were starting to lose their leaves again and the wind smelled like change. Leo trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back as if checking on his team. They stopped near the backyard fence and watched the sky turn pink. What's next for us? Eddie asked. Milo typed something new. College, maybe. Maybe therapy work. Maybe both. Eddie nodded. We'll get there, one bridge at a time. Milo looked up at the fading sky. His fingers moved one last time on the tablet. The river didn't take me, it woke me up. And beside him, Eddie smiled, knowing the same could be said for them all.